While political parties are gearing up for the 2024 general elections already, DA leader John Steenhuisen believes the ANC will dip below the 50% margin and that the country is heading towards a future of coalition governments at both provincial and national level. But coalition governments have not had quite the perfect start, shall we say, in South Africa since 2016, when we saw the very first in metros such as Johannesburg. The EFF's Julius Malema has also said that he would consider a coalition with the ANC if the party elects Paul Mashitile as its president. Let's talk about all of this then with political analyst Asanda Ngoasheng. And Asanda, I'd like you and I to focus on the EFF more broadly in a moment. But first, let me get your reaction, because a lot's been going on in court today. Brian Molefe and another set of former Transnet executives appearing in court. That case, too, has political links allegedly to it. Your reflections?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really amazing that we finally managed to get Brian Molefe and his pals to court to start the process of them accounting for all the corruption that they've been accused of. We know that it's been many, many years of just accusations, and so it's going to be good to get to the court and actually hear them try to defend themselves. And I think this is very important for the ANC, because they've been doing their best to showcase that they are ready to tackle corruption and that they are not afraid to go after their big guns. Because one of the biggest kind of accusations that people have leveled at them is that you're going after the corrupt, but you're not going after the big guns. So I think Brian Molefe and Singh are very big names, and it's going to be interesting to see who else is still coming, because they did mention that there are more names that are still coming, and it's going to be interesting to see how many more of the people implicated in state capture are going to start to see the inside of the courts. Of course, it's not good enough to just have them see the inside of court. What South Africans want is for them to eventually be in jail. But I think it's a very good start, and it's going to bode very well for the ANC in 2024 if they can sustain this level of bringing people to book and starting to hold the corrupt accountable.
Well, if this goes by the South African standard, many of these cases or many of these people will still be waiting in 2024 when we have the national election to hear whether they're convicted or not. And the political parties, I wonder if it's surprising if they're all starting to sort of hedge their bets already 2 years before the vote.
Yeah, it does sound like, I mean, if you listen to the interview with Julius Malema and what's coming out of there, and if you also, kind of throw back to what John Steenhuisen said about 18 months ago about being willing to work with the ANC, especially a Ramaphosa-led ANC, and now we're hearing Julius Malema saying that he would be willing to work with the ANC, which of course brings the question of why now? Why is he suddenly interested in working with the ANC when he has rejected that possibility and idea at every turn, including and especially at municipal, coalition government level?
Let's talk about EFF and ANC. It's an interesting relationship, isn't it? Because one moment they can't stand each other, it appears, and then the next you hear intimate details about what's going on in the ANC from the EFF, and the EFF suggesting even, and others would say perhaps trying to influence, an upcoming ANC conference in December.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was always going to be the case with with Julius Malema having been kicked out of the ANC and him still having very strong ties in the ANC and being friends with a lot of the people who are actually in leadership in the ANC. It doesn't surprise me that from time to time he participates in ANC factionalism politics, as we're seeing now. Suddenly he's backing Paul Mashitile, when previously he was saying Paul Mashitile is a junior leader and is dishonest and you can't, trust anything that he's saying. And I mean, I think it's again interesting to see how political parties, opposition parties, are not only talking about the potential of supporting the ANC, but they're also kind of putting names behind which ANC, which I find very interesting, because it should be that if you're going to support the ANC, that you will support the ANC regardless of who it is that is in power, if it's based on principles. But of course, it's not based on principles. It's based on who can get the best deal from where. And, we all know that these people are friends. They have been in parliament together for many years. And so it doesn't surprise me that they kind of are now dipping into each other's politics and backing different horses within the different, political races and factions.
So in the case of EFF supporters who when Julius Malema and the likes of Floyd Shivambu were basically kicked out of the ANC, left because they felt that it was no longer a party that they wanted to support on that basis and perhaps even ideologically. Where does it leave them then if their alternative is to a degree still so invested in what's going on at Luthuli House?
I mean, I think that everybody's politics is always going to be heavily invested in what's going on in Luthuli House because the ANC is the governing party, and I think that the EFF has, one of the trickiest positions in that it has inside information, it has friends in the ANC, it knows what's happening and what's likely to happen at given stages, and it has to constantly think about how to use that information strategically. Because while you mentioned, for example, that people may have left, and stopped voting for the ANC and voted for the EFF because they wanted to vote against the ANC, the same people may not necessarily want the EFF to collaborate with the DA, for example, and may be offended, and in fact have been offended and have declared that they will no longer vote for the EFF because the EFF, got into a coalition government in municipalities with the DA. And so because the EFF, punts itself as an ideologically specific black and, land and all of these issues, political party, it's always going to be a tricky one who they go with, because if they go with the DA, then they will be accused of, coalition with the very white monopoly capital that they're always criticizing. If they go with the ANC, then they're going to be seen as being in cahoots with the very corrupt that they're always criticizing. And of course, they also like to keep it interesting by doing very interesting things like going to visit the same Jacob Zuma, in Kandla, that they were very adamant needed to pay back money, that they were very adamant was corrupt and not worth, his leadership. And now that he's no longer in power, they were, one of the first groups to go and visit him. And so I think that, there is a level of kind of floundering in terms of which strategy to go. And it does get quite confusing because Julius Malema says one thing today and then tomorrow he says a completely different thing. And so it's very difficult to trust him and what he says. And we know that he's also the worst person to tell any kind of secret or to plan any kind of future with, because he always has a habit of going and, discussing his bedroom politics publicly, if that's what he thinks is going to suit him and his agenda. And we've seen specifically with the issue of migration that he's very much on the wrong side of where South African sentiment is at the moment. And I think that's one thing that's definitely going to cost him a lot of votes.
Let me ask you about that, because when you look at the general EFF support, and I say general because this would be commentary made online and perhaps even on the talk radio stations, whenever the issue of especially African migration comes up, the EFF has very much positioned itself as leaning more towards the Pan-Africanist stance, right? Almost to a degree a borderless Africa, or United States of Africa, if you will, as had been bandied a few years ago by the likes of the late Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi. But when you look at the support base, some of the people will comment and say, while I've supported the EFF on other issues, on this one, the leadership is simply out of touch. And you said that may cost the party, but I wonder to what extent that would be.
I think it's going to be a very costly mistake, because South Africa has moved away from their very basic argument of xenophobia and is now having a nuanced conversation about immigration and regulation and what is fair and what isn't fair in terms of what should and shouldn't be allowed in terms of immigration and the protection of people's human rights. And so I think that they need to develop a more nuanced conversation, because, Pan-Africanism doesn't mean that you cannot engage on issues of immigration regulation, as with all countries across the world as it is. And I think that, we are in an era where globally there are very, very, very difficult conversations taking place around immigration regulation. We've seen with the UK wanting to ship its refugees and asylum seekers to Rwanda, and the Danish very quickly wanting to follow. We're seeing with the complaints that are coming out of the rest of the continent about, the funding by the EU of Libya and the imprisonment of Africans and the enslavement and human trafficking of Africans there. And so we are in an era where there is a global pushback against immigration, particularly unregulated and illegal immigration. And so they are literally are trying to, kind of go against a global swell. And so I'm actually surprised that they haven't caught on, that they're going to have to deliver a much more nuanced conversation or exit the conversation, because political parties like Action South Africa and Gayton McKenzie's political party and many others are jumping on this bandwagon of looking for tougher stances against immigrants and looking for more stringent action on immigration.
You mentioned Julius Malema, and you used the phrasing agenda, and he's been accused of an agenda in Gauteng where some within the party, a few, have been giving interviews alleging that Julius Malema tried to dictate the outcome of a leadership election in Gauteng. He said in a briefing last week that that's gossip, there's no legitimate grievance brought forward. But to what extent is the EFF, almost 10 years on, its survival, its growth, to what extent is that still linked to his fortunes as an individual politician?
I think it definitely is, and I think this is the tricky part that the EFF always have to navigate. That Julius Malema is a very controversial figure who both attracts and repels voters and supporters, and so you often find that somebody really is a big fan of Julius Malema or really can't stand the guy, and so that's always going to be a tricky one for them. And I think also one of the questions they're going to have to start asking, that they're going to have to start answering, is when is the EFF going to deliver a new leadership? Because we've had, the UDM wasn't declined because people were tired of knowing that Olomisa is always going to be the only leader that they'll pitch. And same with the IFP until very recently when Mangosuthu Buthelezi stepped down. So they're going to have to start answering how can they claim to be custodians of democracy when they don't have internal democracy, and it's almost guaranteed that the same guy is going to continue to be the leader. And, we are in an Africa where we are very dictator wary, and we are very wary of people who overstay their terms in leadership. And so he's going to have to fight very hard to convince people why he should continue to be the leader until, the day Jesus comes back, as the ANC likes to tell us. Because, people want to see changes and shifts in leadership. And I think particularly young people, and what we're seeing, I think, in South Africa is an era of fast politics where young people can be on this page, on this issue today, and very quickly tomorrow move to, the complete opposite. And that requires a lot of understanding of the nuance of these issues. And it requires political parties to be flexible in a way that political parties are not always able to be flexible because they like keeping to the same standpoint and ideologies.
Asanda Ngoasheng, good to speak to you. Thank you.